They started laughing on the morning of the first day, before the session was even called to order. I had my tablet out, a standard-issue flat-plate recorder, the kind every archivist carries, nothing special about it, and I was running the baseline calibration the same way I do at the start of every session. Tap the screen twice, confirm the timestamp, open the log file, run a quick character recognition check. It takes maybe 40 seconds. I've done it so many times I do it without looking. I had my coffee in my other hand. The Jevhari delegation was already seated on the far side of the long table. There were 11 of them. Their lead negotiator, a senior caste principal named Keth Zavar, had taken the center chair. To his left and right sat his senior counsel and 2 senior analysts. The remaining 7 were junior staff, some of them quite young, in the way that Jevhari youth shows, which is mostly in the segmentation of the carapace plates along the thorax. The newer ones haven't hardened fully yet, and you can see the color difference if you know what to look for. The youngest of the 7 had the pale amber tint of recent molting. He couldn't have been more than a decade past emergence. I noticed them before they noticed me. They were talking among themselves in Jevhari, low, rapid clicks and tonal shifts, the kind of conversation that has a rhythm to it, a social ease. Then one of the junior staff caught sight of my tablet and said something in a register I recognized as informal observational. The others looked. And then, not all at once, but in a little ripple that moved from the junior staff up toward the senior principals, they laughed. Not loudly. The Jevhari don't do loud in the way some species do. Their equivalent of a laugh is a quick, syncopated click pattern in the upper register, like someone running their thumbnail very fast across a fine-toothed comb. Several of them did it at once. Keth Zavar made the same sound, but slower, more deliberate, the way you laugh when you're a senior official, and you want your junior staff to know you've noticed the joke without committing fully to it. It was a very precise performance. He had been making that exact sound, I suspected, for 30 years. I finished my calibration. I took a sip of my coffee. I did not look up. Our side of the table had 4 humans. Commander Reyes, who was leading our negotiating position, Senior Liaison Aldrich Van, who handled the formal protocols, Sub-Liaison Petra Chu, whose specialty was Jevhari Trade Corridor Precedent, and me, Danny Osai, Junior Archivist attached to Waystation Orvith's Records Division since the previous rotation. My job was to document the session. That was my entire function in that room. I was not there to negotiate, advise, or speak. I was there to write things down. The briefing concerned transit rights through the Cedral Corridor, a long-disputed navigational channel that ran through the outer edge of territory, both humans and the Jevhari considered adjacent to their sphere of operation. The Jevhari had been making incremental moves on corridor access for about 8 months, using a series of overlapping administrative claims that were each individually small and each individually difficult to contest, but which, taken together, amounted to a slow reclassification of the channel's status. After 3 rounds of preliminary correspondence that had gone nowhere useful, the decision had been made to bring both parties to Waystation Orvith for a formal joint session. 4 days. Structured agenda, every session documented and logged. What the Jevhari thought of the documentation aspect was, apparently, apparent from the moment they saw my tablet. I found out later, much later, after everything had been translated and cross-referenced and entered into the formal record, what that first junior staff member had said when he saw me calibrating. The word he used was one I'd seen in reference materials but hadn't heard used aloud before. It translates most cleanly as scratching. The Jevhari have a category of behavior they associate with very young larvae, repetitive tactile marking on surfaces, before the organism has developed any real cognitive framework to go with it. Scratching. The word carries a connotation of pre-verbal, instinctive, essentially meaningless. Something you do before you've learned better, something you grow out of. That was what they called it, my documentation, my calibration, my entire function in that room. Scratching. I wrote it down. The first session ran 4 hours. Commander Reyes opened with the formal position statement, 12 minutes, carefully worded, laying out the transitrites framework our side wanted to establish. 12 points, each one specific, each one anchored to an existing precedent in the Cedral Corridor's navigational history going back 40 years. Reyes had been working on that statement for 3 weeks. It was a good statement. Kethzavar listened with the particular stillness the Jevhari use in formal settings, the kind that looks like patience but is actually something more like evaluation. The way a large, chitinous creature sits very still while it decides what it's looking at. His anterior eye clusters, the Jevhari have 3 sets, arranged in an asymmetric arc across the upper face, tracked raised steadily throughout. His maxillary plates were pressed flat, which is the senior cast neutral expression, the expression that gives nothing. He was good at it. When Reyes finished, Kethzavar responded with a counterposition statement that ran nearly 20 minutes. His Jevhari was formal and precise, delivered in a register that the translation feed rendered smoothly. His junior staff filed in and out at intervals, passing him slender data rods that he slotted into the reader built into the table. His senior counsel, whose name translated roughly as Velsharath, a long, narrow creature with the dark chitinous sheen of advanced age and the deliberate economy of movement that very old Jevhari develop, offered clarifying amendments at 3 points in the statement. I logged all of it, time-stamped, speaker identified verbatim where verbatim was possible, summarized where the translation required synthesis. I have a decent working vocabulary in Jevhari, enough to catch errors in real time if the translation feed hiccups, enough to follow the structure of a sentence before the rendered text comes through. So I was running parallel checks as I typed, flagging anything that looked like a rendering error. There were 2 in the first session, both minor, both corrected within the same paragraph. One was a tense issue in a conditional clause. One was a rendering of a Jevhari castrank honorific that the feed had collapsed into a general title. I expanded it. At the midpoint break, 2 of the junior Jevhari staff watched me reviewing my log from across the table. They were eating the Jevhari equivalent of a snack, small, dense pellets of processed mineral, compound that they crunch between their maxillary plates, which produces a sound like gravel in a tumbler. And they were watching me with an expression I'd come to recognize, which is the slightly elevated angle of the anterior eye cluster that the Jevhari use when something is interesting, but also a little puzzling. Like watching someone do something that isn't quite wrong but isn't quite right either. The way you might watch someone sort pebbles by size for no apparent reason. Curious, but not particularly concerned. One of them said something to the other. The other clicked a quick acknowledgement. Neither of them said anything to me or about me loudly enough to be directed at me, but I caught it anyway. The word came up again, scratching, and then a phrase I hadn't seen in the reference materials, something that translated as near as I could work it out, running it through the mental lexicon I'd built up over 2 years of Jevhari language study, as for comfort perhaps. The way you describe a behavior that has no functional purpose but that the organism finds soothing. The way you'd explain why a creature paces, or clicks its own mandibles together, or makes repetitive marks on a surface. Not communication, not information, not even memory in any meaningful sense, comfort behavior, the kind of thing you tolerate in young organisms and in species that haven't yet developed better methods. I finished my coffee. I went back to my log. I noted the timestamp on both remarks, flagged the translation as my own working rendering rather than official feed output, and continued the review. Day 1 ended with the formal parameters established and 2 sub-items tabled for the next session. Kethzavar made on the record a clear and unambiguous commitment to the baseline transitaxis framework our side had proposed, with amendments to the scheduling cadence and a modification to the inspection protocol. It was in plain Jevhari, with our translation feed running clean, and I had it in the log word for word. The scheduling cadence amendment was specific. Intervals of no less than 30 days between corridor inspection cycles, with a mutual notification requirement of 7 days prior to any unscheduled access. The inspection protocol modification was also specific. Joint inspection teams, with at least one representative from each party present for any formal review. Both were good outcomes, better than our side had expected on the first day. I filed the session record, synced it to the station archive, and went to bed. The second day was when they got comfortable. I think it happened because the first day had gone smoothly. Nobody had caused trouble. Reyes was diplomatic without being soft. Van managed the protocol points precisely. Chu had the trade corridor precedent ready every time it was needed, which was several times, and which she delivered each time with the particular calm of someone who has memorized a great deal of material and finds the deployment of it satisfying. The session had proceeded the way formal sessions are supposed to proceed, and I think Kethzavar read that smoothness as a kind of predictability. He knew what kind of meeting this was. He knew the shape of it. He had done this before. And I was just the archivist. He started in the morning. Not aggressively. The Jevhari senior cast doesn't do aggression at a briefing table. It's considered crude, and Kethzavar was many things, but he was not crude. What he did was more like a performance. He was a skilled one. He had, I guessed, been in formal sessions for a very long time, and he had the particular ease of a creature who has learned that it can take up as much space as it wants without anyone objecting. There is a specific quality to that kind of ease. It's not arrogance, exactly. It's more settled than arrogance. It's the ease of a creature who has been right so many times in so many rooms that it has stopped checking whether it's right anymore. He began making asides. Not in the translation channel. In Jevhari, at a register and cadence that would have been clearly off the record to anyone who was treating my side of the table the way he expected. As a group who had the translation feed but not the live language comprehension, who would get the rendered English text with a 2-second lag, who would hear the formal content and miss everything in between. He addressed Velsharath. He addressed his junior staff. He made observations. He made jokes. He did it in the way a veteran negotiator will, when they're comfortable. The way you talk to your own people when you've decided the room is yours, and the other side is present but not quite listening. I wrote it all down. His first aside was a short one, a comment about the arrangement of documents on our side of the table, which he compared unfavorably to the Jevhari caste organizational system. Not mean-spirited, more like a man noticing that someone else has set their desk up wrong. The junior staff gave him the polite acknowledgement click, the short, single-beat pattern that means something between yes and noted in that register. Nothing barbed in it. Just an observation from a senior official who had an opinion about how things should be organized. The second aside was about me specifically. It came about 40 minutes into the morning session, during a technical sub-discussion about corridor inspection intervals. I had reached the bottom of a log section and was doing a quick review pass, scrolling back, checking timestamps, cross-referencing a phrase that the feed had flagged as a possible ambiguity. And Kethzavar, while Aldrich Van was pulling up a reference document on the corridor's historical access records, turned to Velsharath and said something that I caught cleanly. The translation is a little loose because the Jevhari have tonal register layers that English doesn't carry well, but the substance of it was. The small one still scratches. Did you notice? Every time there is a pause, it reviews. It reviews as though it will need what it finds. Velsharath's response: the larvae do that also, loop checking, before they develop memory. Yes. And then Kethzavar made the slow, deliberate version of the comb laugh. It was appreciably more relaxed than the one on day one. He was settling in. I completed my review pass. I flagged the timestamp on both remarks. I entered them into the log under, aside Principal KZ, off-record, Jevhari original preserved. Then I went back to the inspection intervals discussion, because Van had found the reference document and we were continuing. The session continued. Over the course of the morning, I counted 9 asides. Not all of them were about me. 3 were about the documentation practice in general, the human habit of recording spoken proceedings in text form, which the Jevhari find genuinely puzzling. Their own record-keeping tradition is oral, cast memorized, passed through designated memory cast members who are trained from youth to retain and recite. They don't write things down because they don't need to. Their memory cast members are more reliable than any mechanical record, by their own accounting, and they are probably not wrong about that. The memory cast training program runs from emergence through adulthood. It is conducted under controlled conditions with rigorous verification protocols, and a fully trained memory cast member can reproduce a 6-hour session verbatim years later with documented accuracy rates above 98%. I have a lot of respect for the Jevhari memory cast system. I've read about it extensively. It is a genuine achievement of biological and pedagogical engineering. What they don't have is a record that exists outside the memory cast. What they don't have is a document that doesn't depend on any individual being alive, willing, and present to produce. What they don't have, at the end of a session, is a file that sits in an archive and does not require anyone's cooperation to access. I wrote that down too, in my personal notes section, not in the formal log, professional interest, the kind of thing you think about when you've been doing this work long enough to notice what other systems can and can't do. The afternoon session introduced the first complication. Velsharath, speaking formally and on record, referenced the preliminary corridor access terms discussed in the first session and framed them as the Jevhari initial position, subject to further development. The phrasing was careful. It had the texture of a legal hedge, not a reversal, not yet, but a preparation for one. A door left slightly open. The word preliminary was doing a lot of work, and subject to further development was doing the rest. Keth Savar let it pass without comment, which meant he'd approved it. I flagged it in the log, pulled up the morning one record, time-stamped the delta, cross-referenced the specific language from day one, the clear and unambiguous commitment I had noted against the new framing. The gap between them was not enormous, but it existed, and in my experience, gaps of that kind do not close on their own. They have a tendency to widen. Reyes and Van exchanged a look across the table that I noticed but didn't log. That wasn't my material to capture. What I log is spoken content, not human facial expressions. Chu made a note on her own tablet. I kept typing. I've been doing this work long enough to know the shape of what was happening, and I think Reyes and Van had done similar work long enough to know it too. The technique is old. It works because it is gradual, and because each individual step is deniable. This word or that phrasing could always be imprecision, could always be translation variance, could always be a reasonable difference in how one characterizes an opening position versus a settled one. Any single step, taken in isolation, would be difficult to object to without seeming either paranoid or obstructive. You'd be the side that can't tolerate normal negotiating flexibility. You'd be the side that's turning a working session into a confrontation over word choice. The technique works because it relies on the other side being unwilling to produce the receipts. I was producing the receipts. I was always producing the receipts. That was my job. By the end of day 2, the Jevhari had introduced 4 phrases that, taken individually, might have been imprecision or translation artifact, but taken together formed the beginning of an obvious pattern. The preliminary framing was being quietly softened, and the baseline transitaxis commitment from day 1 was being walked back into something more like a position under active discussion, which is a very different thing from a commitment. The inspection protocol modification had been recharacterized as the proposed modification as currently expressed, with the phrase as currently expressed doing the same preparatory work that, subject to further development, had done earlier. The scheduling cadence had been gently relocated from agreed adjustment to the scheduling parameters under current consideration. And the joint inspection language from day one had lost its specificity around representation requirements, becoming the inspection framework as discussed, which could mean anything. 4 items, 4 progressions, each one small enough individually to blame on the normal imprecision of translation and the natural development of a multi-day session, each one moving in exactly the same direction. The 11 entries in my log from day one said otherwise. I synced the record, flagged the Delta summary for Commander Reyes in a brief attached note, and went to bed. Day 3 was the performance. I think Kethzavar had decided, by the third morning, that he had this session structured the way he wanted it, that the Delta accumulation was going unnoticed, or at least uncontested, that our side was either too polite or too uncertain to push back on the reframing, and that by the end of day 4 he would be able to walk away with an agreement that preserved Jevhari corridor primacy under the language of a joint framework. The transit access terms would be flexible enough to interpret favorably. The inspection protocol would have enough hedging language to render it advisory rather than binding. The scheduling cadence would drift, and in 6 months, the Central Corridor would be, functionally, a Jevhari channel with a human consultation component that could be delayed indefinitely. He had probably done this before. Not here, not with us, but the pattern is not unique to the Jevhari. Gradual softening, careful rephrasing, the formal commitment that gets walked back to a preliminary position over 3 days until it's no longer a commitment at all. You find versions of it everywhere. It works because most sessions don't have an archivist who is tracking every word in the source language in parallel with the translated feed, and because most records go into archives where no one looks at them until long after the leverage is gone. It also works because it is polite. That is the part people don't always appreciate. The technique is designed to be polite. Each step is framed as a natural development of the conversation. Each hedge is framed as clarification. The person on the receiving end of it faces a choice between accepting the reframing gracefully or objecting to it and seeming difficult, seeming inflexible, seeming like the side that doesn't understand how negotiation works. The technique exploits the social cost of objecting. It relies on the fact that raising a procedural flag is uncomfortable, that producing a document and pointing to a discrepancy in front of 11 people is an act that carries a certain weight, and that most people would rather absorb a small loss than carry that weight. He was good at it, I'll say that. He had the technique down completely. What he didn't account for was that I was also good at what I did. He opened the morning session with a brief formal statement that recast the day 1 baseline entirely, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that any archivist would recognize as a reclassification. The transit access framework was now the framework under consideration. The inspection protocol modification was now the proposed modification. The scheduling cadence commitment was now the scheduling preference expressed by the Jevhari delegation. Every commitment from day 1 had been reclassified as an aspiration. I kept writing. 40 minutes in, Kethzavar made his longest aside of the session. He was addressing his junior staff directly, all 7 of them, turning slightly in his chair to include them, in the manner of a senior official who is confident that the teaching moment is available. These asides had become, over 3 days, a kind of parallel seminar. Kethzavar using the sessions to instruct his junior staff in negotiating technique, with the humans at the other side of the table serving, apparently, as the practical demonstration. He talked about the structure of negotiation. He talked about the way different species approach it. He spent a while on the human approach specifically, and he was not unkind about it. He was the opposite of unkind, actually. He was generous in the condescending way that a very senior creature is generous when explaining something to something it considers younger and less developed. The generosity of the patient teacher who finds the subject matter slightly sad. He said, and I am working from my log entry here, which I kept verbatim, that humans had an interesting relationship with record keeping, in that they substituted external storage for internal precision. Where the Jevhari trained their memory cast to hold information perfectly, humans trained no one, and instead tried to compensate with mechanical notation. The result was a kind of institutional false confidence, the belief that because something was written down, it existed. That because a mark had been scratched, a fact had been captured. That the scratch was the memory, when in fact the scratch was only a mark, and a mark is a very different thing. But a scratch, he said, is not a memory. A scratch is a mark, and a mark depends on someone to read it and someone to honor what was read and someone to confirm what was honored. At every step it can be lost. At every step it requires a chain of assent that a true memory does not require. The true memory requires nothing but the memory cast member and the one who asks. Between them, no chain, no links to break. His junior staff clicked the formal acknowledgement pattern. Two of them glanced at me. The young one with the amber plates was watching me with what I had come to think of as his particular expression. Not hostile, but intent, the way a young organism looks at something it is genuinely trying to understand. I was writing it down. I have thought about that moment since. Kethsavar was not entirely wrong, and I want to be fair about that. He understood the vulnerability of written records very well. He had spent his career exploiting precisely that vulnerability, the gap between the mark and the assent, the distance between what was written and what was honored. He was correct that a chain of assent is a thing with links, and that links can be broken, and that a system which depends on chains can be failed by any single link in any given moment. He was right about all of that. What he had not accounted for, what he could not have known, because no one had told him, and because our briefing coordinator had not thought to mention it in the session parameters, and because it was not the kind of thing that was announced or highlighted or particularly visible, was the Orvith Standard Documentation Protocol, which had been in place since the station's second year of operation, and which I had been following since the moment I walked into that room and ran my 40-second calibration. Under the Orvith SDR, Standard Documentation and Redundancy Protocol, file reference OVT Admin 17.4, available in the Station Operations Manual under Records and Archival. Every formal session conducted in the primary briefing facility is automatically recorded on 3 independent channels. One is the archivist's tablet log, which is what everyone can see. One is the station's central record system, which ingests the tablet feed in real time and stores it in the main archive with automatic backup to the secondary station drive. And one is the operations deck audio capture, which runs on a separate system entirely, does not rely on the translation feed, and records raw audio in every language present in the room, preserved as uncompressed source files. The operations deck channel is always active during a formal session. It does not show a recording indicator in the room. The indicator light was removed after a session participant 3 administrations ago complained about it being distracting, and the administration at the time decided that removing the indicator was simpler than explaining the protocol, and no subsequent administration had reinstated it. And so, for the past 11 years, the room had been recording without anyone in it being visually reminded of this fact. The protocol requires participants to be informed that sessions are recorded, which they are, in the Session Parameters Document, Item 14, Subsection 3, under Documentation and Record-Keeping Procedures. The document is transmitted to all parties 48 hours before the first session. It is transmitted in all relevant languages, with a request for acknowledgement of receipt, which the Jevhari delegation had provided on schedule. Whether Kethsavar had read past Item 4, I genuinely cannot say. What I can say is that on the operations deck, accessible to me and to Commander Reyes and to any station officer with the appropriate clearance, there existed 3 days of clean audio in original Jevhari. Every word spoken in that room, by everyone in that room, including every aside, every joke, every slow, deliberate comb laugh, every teaching moment conducted for the benefit of junior staff who were watching the small human scratch its marks on its little tablet. I had not mentioned this. It had not come up in any session. Why would it? Everyone in that room knew about it in the sense that everyone who had read item 14, subsection 3 already knew. And everyone who hadn't read it, well, the information was available. The document had been transmitted. The acknowledgement had been returned. I synced my day 3 morning log. I wrote a short note to Commander Ray's 8 sentences, no preamble. The note said, Day 4 review recommended. I have flagged the delta accumulation across all 3 days. 4 formal commitments from day 1 have been progressively reclassified as preliminary positions or express preferences. I'd suggest we bring the OPSDEC pull into the session package before we open day 4. SDR item 14.3 covers the procedure. I can have the full audio cross-reference ready by 700. The cross-reference will carry verbatim Jevhari originals alongside the session log. I'll include the informal session content as well. I think it's relevant. Ray's replied 40 minutes later, 3 words, yes, please do. Day 3 afternoon and evening, I spent in the records room with a pot of coffee and a translation assist program that I use for long sessions. It speeds up the initial rendering so I can focus on the quality check rather than the basic transcription. I went through all 3 days of audio, cross-referenced with my log, and generated a time-stamped comparative document. Formal record on the left, full Jevhari content on the right, delta flags in red. The format is one I developed over about 2 years of doing this work, through trial and error, and a number of sessions where I wished I'd had a cleaner way to present the comparison. It prints clearly. It's easy to read even if you don't know the source language because the delta flags are self-explanatory. Here is what was on the record, here is what was said, here is the distance between them. There were 37 flagged deltas from formal session content. There were 19 logged asides, all preserved verbatim in Jevhari with working translations. There were 4 formal commitments from day 1, all clearly rendered in both languages, all subsequently reclassified in days 2 and 3, with the progression of reclassification tracked step by step across all 3 sets of session logs. It was 16 pages. It was, if I say so myself, a very clean document. I finished the cross-reference at about 1:30. I ran a final check, corrected 2 translation choices I wasn't happy with in the informal content section, verified that all timestamps matched across the 3 source channels, and exported the final version. Then I sat with the empty coffee pot for a while and thought about nothing in particular, which is what I do when I've been working for a long time and I need to give my head a moment before I sleep. I filed the cross-reference to Commander Ray's inbox. I left a copy in the records room for my own reference. I went to bed at 2:10. Day 4 opened quietly. Kethsavar arrived 3 minutes before the session. He had the ease of someone who considers a matter essentially decided, the same settled quality I had noticed on day 2, but more pronounced now, the ease of finality rather than the ease of progress. His junior staff filed in behind him in the standard configuration, 7 in the triangular arrangement, memory cast member at the apex. Velshareth was already seated when they arrived, which was unusual. He had come early. He was reviewing something on a data rod, and he did not look up when Kethsavar entered. Our side arrived together at the session start time. Ray's, Van Chu, me. I had the tablet calibrated and open the same as every morning. I also had a secondary hard copy folder, which I placed on the table in front of my seat without opening it. The folder had a plain gray cover, standard records division issue, the same folder I use for every hard copy print job. It was perhaps 2 centimeters thick. Kethsavar noticed the folder. I saw him notice it, a small, directed attention, the anterior eye clusters angling briefly toward it and then away. His expression remained neutral. He looked at the session agenda on his side of the table. Ray's opened with a brief statement, 4 sentences, formal, efficient, no preamble. The fourth sentence was, "Before we proceed to the Day 4 agenda, I'd like to address a documentation question." Kethzavar made the stillness expression, "Of course." My archivist has noted several points of divergence between the formal commitments recorded in the Day 1 session log and the characterizations offered in subsequent sessions. I'd like to clarify those before we move forward. Velshareth made a small, smooth movement beside Kethzavar, not quite a lean forward but a preparation for one. A very slight shift in posture, the kind that means something in Jevhari body language but is easy to miss if you're not watching for it. The junior staff behind them had the elevated anterior eye cluster expression, the something interesting and puzzling look, the one I had been seeing for 3 days. It was more pronounced now. Several of them had it simultaneously. Kethzavar's response was courteous and level. The Jevhari delegation has been consistent in its position. If there are translation concerns, we are of course available to address them. No translation concerns, Reyes said. The translation was clean, the documentation is precise. A brief pause. Danny. I opened the folder. The comparative document was printed on standard station paper, 16 pages, time-stamped on every page, with the source references for both the tablet log and the OPSTEC audio pull listed in the header. I set the first page on the table facing Kethzavar. The format was simple. 2 columns, left and right, formal record and full Jevhari content, with the flagged deltas in red. This is the formal session record from Day 1, I said. I said it in Jevhari. My Jevhari is workmanlike but functional, and I had spent part of the previous evening making sure I had the formal phrasing right. And this is the full audio record from the same session, preserved on the station's operations deck under Standard Documentation and Redundancy Protocol, Item 14, Subsection 3, which was provided to your delegation in the pre-session parameters document 48 hours prior to the first session. I waited a moment for that to settle. I watched Velshareth look at the document. I watched his anterior eye cluster angle shift, more than the puzzled curious angle, this was sharper. I watched Kethzavar's carapace, specifically the thoracic plates, which in the Jevhari senior caste carry most of the involuntary postural signaling, the equivalent of a human's shoulders, go from the relaxed, slightly convex arrangement of easy confidence to something tighter. Not alarmed. Not yet. Tighter. Reassessing. The operations deck audio, I said, still in Jevhari, also preserves the informal session content, the asides, the instructional remarks made during session pauses, including, and here I found the flagged entry on page 6, the long one from Day 3 morning, and I read it back to him, verbatim in the register in which it had been delivered with the timing it had been given, the part about scratching not being a memory, the part about the chain of ascent, the part about the larvae. The room was quiet. Kethzavar said nothing for 11 seconds. I counted. I had my tablet open and I was logging because that was my job, and the timestamp on his silence is in the record, for whatever it's worth. Then he said in Jevhari, in a register I would describe as carefully neutral, the operations deck audio. Yes, I said, all 3 days. Another silence, shorter. Velshareth said something to him in a low register, too low for me to catch cleanly, and I didn't try. Private exchange, not my material. I pulled out page 7 and set it in front of the first page. This is the cross-reference for the Day 1 formal commitments and their subsequent characterizations in Days 2 and 3. There are 4 items. The first is the baseline transitaxis framework. On Day 1, the formal statement was, and I read it back in the original Jevhari with the timestamp. Then, on Day 3, the characterization was, and I read that back. The delta is here in red. I pointed to it. The second item is the inspection protocol modification. I went through all 4. I did not rush. I did not editorialize. I did not say anything about what the delta meant or why it existed or what I thought about it. I read what was in the document and I pointed to the relevant lines. That is the job. It took 9 minutes. The Jevhari side of the table was very still for all 9 of them. At some point during the 4th item, I became aware that the young one, the amber-plated junior staff member who had been watching me most intently over the past 3 days, was not looking at Kethzavar. He was looking at me. His expression was something I hadn't seen on him before. I didn't have a name for it. I filed it. When I finished, I closed the folder and set it in front of Kethzavar. There are copies for each member of the delegation if that would be useful. That will not be necessary, he said. His Jevhari was precise and extremely formal, the register you use when you are choosing your words with great care, when every word is selected rather than simply produced. The register of a creature who has reassessed the room and is recalibrating. Of course, I said. I picked up my coffee, which had been sitting there throughout, and took a sip. Ray's let the silence run for a moment. Not long. She's not someone who prolongs silences for effect. She just doesn't fill them when there's nothing that needs filling. Then she said simply, "Shall we address the 4 items?" And Kethzavar said, "Yes." I want to be precise about what happened next, because I've heard the story told a few ways since then, and some of the versions have acquired embellishments that weren't in the room. There was no confrontation. There was no raised voice, no display, no formal acknowledgement of error from Kethzavar, no moment where he offered anything that could be called an apology, direct or indirect. That is not how the Jevhari senior cast operates, and I would not have expected it. Kethzavar was not, at any point, the kind of creature who made dramatic gestures, and he was not about to start. What happened was more subtle, and, in its own way, more complete. We went through the 4 items. On each one, Ray's put the day 1 language on the table, not aggressively, just directly, the way you put a document on a table when you'd like to discuss it, and asked for the Jevhari delegation's current position. On 3 of the 4, Kethzavar provided a response that restored the day 1 framing, without comment on the intervening recharacterizations. No acknowledgement of the gap. No explanation. The day 1 language simply reappeared, as though it had been there all along, which, in the log, it had been. On the 4th item, the scheduling cadence, Velshareth offered a revised formulation. It was a genuine compromise between the day 1 commitment and the Jevhari preference. The inspection intervals would be 35 days rather than 30, with a 10-day advance notification requirement rather than 7. The difference was small. It was also genuinely reasonable. There were logistical grounds for the Jevhari preference that Chu had flagged in her corridor precedent notes, and Van and Chu approved it after a brief sidebar that ran about 4 minutes. Kethzavar waded through the sidebar in silence. He did not look at me during it. By midday, we had a clean agreement on all 4 items. It was in the record, both the tablet log and the obstec pull. The afternoon session covered the remaining agenda items. Kethzavar was formal and efficient and correct. He made no asides. His junior staff were quiet and attentive. The memory cast member at the apex of their formation, who had been so still for most of the afternoon of day 2 and all of day 3, was simply present now, not strained, not performing, just there in the way you are when you have decided to be straightforwardly in the room. The session moved at a good pace. Everything on the agenda got addressed. Van handled a protocol question about the formal ratification timeline with his usual precision. Chu caught a corridor precedent citation that was slightly off and corrected it in real time, which I appreciated because it saved me from having to flag it in the post-session notes. Ray's managed the whole afternoon with the particular economy she brings to sessions when things are going well. Minimum words, maximum clarity, no wasted motion. I logged all of it. At the end of the final session, Kethzavar made the formal closing statement. It was correct in all its particulars. He thanked Commander Ray's and the human delegation for the sessions. He expressed the Jevhari delegation's satisfaction with the outcome and the intent to proceed to formal ratification in accordance with the agreed timeline. His Jevhari was precise and formal and entirely without the layered register work of the past 3 days. No asides, no undertone, nothing between the lines. Then, before he stood to leave, he looked at me. I was logging the closing remarks. I looked up when I felt his attention. He said in Jevhari, and I logged it, because that was my job, something I would translate, keeping as close to the register as English allows as, "The archivist is well named to her function." In the Jevhari caste system, being called well named to function is a specific kind of acknowledgement. It means the creature has demonstrated not just competence but alignment, the sense that the role and the individual are correctly matched, which is the thing the Jevhari value most in organized systems. A well-named thing is a thing in its right place, doing its right work without waste or misapplication. It is not a small thing to say. It is not casual. Senior caste principals do not say it lightly, and Keth Zavar was not a creature who said anything lightly. I said in Jevhari, "Thank you," because that is the correct response and because it was. He left, his delegation filed out behind him. The 7 junior staff went last. 2 of them looked at me as they passed. I did not read their expressions as hostile or even particularly surprised. They were more settled than that, the expression of creatures who have learned something and are in the process of integrating it. The young one, the amber-plated one, paused for just a moment at the door, not long enough for it to be a formal thing. Just a moment. Then he continued out. Ray's caught my eye after they'd gone. She didn't say anything. She just gave me a nod, the particular nod that means good work, in the wordless dialect that every operations team develops over time. Then she started gathering her documents. Van made a quiet comment to Chu about the timeline for the ratification package. Normal post-session work. I synced my final log, closed the tablet, and began the end-of-session procedures. File the record, copy to the archive, generate the formal session summary, attach the OPSDEC pull as supporting documentation, flag the cross-reference document as primary reference for any future review. Standard, routine. The same thing I did at the end of every session, on every assignment, in every room where I had ever sat with my coffee and my calibration check, and my 40 seconds of setup that apparently looked like a creature performing a comfort behavior. I finished the summary at about 21:30. I was in the records room, which is quiet at that hour, just the ambient hum of the station's environmental systems and the soft tick of the archive drives. I went through the document one more time, which I always do because I always do, not because I'm anxious about it. It's not anxiety. It's just the job. You write the record and then you check it and then you file it, and the record exists independent of you from that point forward. I checked the timestamps, cross-referenced the delta flags, confirmed that the 4 items were rendered correctly in both the formal log and the summary, and that the final session language matched the agreed text from the morning. It did. I filed it. Then I sat there for a moment with my empty coffee mug and thought about what Kethsevar had said on day 3. The thing about a scratch not being a memory, about the chain of ascent that every written record requires, about the way a mark depends on someone to read it and someone to honor it. He wasn't wrong is the thing. I think about that. A record does require someone to honor it. You can write something down perfectly, with every timestamp in order and every word correctly rendered, and if the people on both sides of the table decide to ignore it, it just sits there. A chain of ascent really does have links. The vulnerability he described is real. But a record also exists outside the person who made it, and outside the person who was supposed to read it and didn't, and outside the person who was supposed to honor it and was choosing not to. It sits in the archive. It accumulates. It waits. And when the chain of ascent breaks, when someone decides the commitment wasn't a commitment, or the word wasn't the word, or the thing that was said in a room wasn't quite the thing that was meant, the record is still there. It was there before anyone decided to honor it or not. It will be there after. Patient as stone, more patient actually. I washed my mug, turned off the light and went to bed. The formal agreement was transmitted to the Jevhari Caste Council 11 days later, along with the complete session record and the OPSTEC audio pull as required under the SDR protocol. I understand it was reviewed at some length by the Council's External Relations Division. I was not party to that review, and I have no direct knowledge of what was said in it, or by whom, or in what register. What I do know is that 3 months after the Orvith sessions, the Jevhari formally amended their external negotiation preparation protocols to include a standing requirement for participants to review the full documentation parameters of any joint session venue before the first day. The amendment specifically references, and I am not guessing at this, I pulled the official text when it was circulated through Intercast Liaison, because that is the kind of thing I do, the complete scope of archival procedures employed by non-Jevhari hosts, including but not limited to redundant recording systems, remote channel capture, and multi-source session preservation. They also, I understand, added a dedicated briefing item to their pre-session preparation protocol, specifically addressing the possibility that not all recording systems in a joint venue will have visible indicators. The briefing item is required for all delegation members above the rank of junior staff, and it is apparently quite thorough. They call the new protocol the Orvith Amendment. I didn't know that for a long time. A colleague in the Intercast Liaison Division mentioned it in passing, about a year after the sessions, in the way you mention a piece of procedural trivia. A thing that exists in some document somewhere and has a name, and doesn't have much to do with the everyday work of running a records office on a way station. I thanked him for mentioning it. I made a note. Force of habit. There's a thing that happens when you've been an archivist long enough, which is that you stop thinking about the record as something separate from the thing it records. They are the same thing. The session and the document of the session, the commitment and the log entry, the remark and the timestamp that fixes it in time, that anchors it to a specific moment in a specific room on a specific channel that cannot be altered without leaving a trace. They exist together, and you cannot have one without the other, and the only question that has ever mattered, in any room I have ever sat in with my tablet and my coffee, is who in the room understands that. Kethzavar understood it eventually. I'll give him that. He is a smart creature and he adjusted. That's not nothing. Most species do, once they've sat across from a human archivist who was paying attention. We are very good at paying attention. We've been doing it for a long time, longer than most species that are currently in the business of dismissing us as primitive have been keeping any kind of record at all. We did it before we had the technology to do it easily. We did it on paper, on clay, on fired brick, on stone, on every surface that would hold a mark. We scratched it into things. We scratched it into everything we could find. Receipts for grain in Mesopotamia. Tax records in Egypt. Trade agreements carved into stone so they couldn't be lost or burned or conveniently forgotten. Treaties written out and folded into the walls of buildings so they would survive whoever built the building and whoever came after. We have been keeping records since before we had cities, and we kept them before we had any real reason to think anyone would ever look at them again. The impulse is older than the usefulness. We scratch things because we are scratchers. And here is the thing about scratchers, the thing that Kethzavar understood too late. We didn't develop external storage because we lacked internal precision. We developed it because we distrust our own memory. Because we have always known, in a way I suspect the Jevhari haven't had to learn yet, that individual memory is fallible, perishable, subject to revision, subject to the interests of the person doing the remembering. We know that memory changes. We know that what you remember of a conversation and what the other person remembers can drift apart over time, can be shaped by what you wanted to happen, what you expected to happen, what you needed to have happened. We know this because we live in the same skulls as our memories, and we have had occasion to notice. So we wrote it down, not because we couldn't remember, because we knew we couldn't trust ourselves to remember it perfectly. That's not a weakness. That's the oldest epistemological lesson we ever taught ourselves, carved into clay before we had a word for epistemology. Do not trust your own account of events without an external check. Verify, record, cross-reference. The Jevhari trust their memory cast completely. That trust is well-founded. The memory cast is extraordinary. But it is trust in individuals. It is trust in a chain of biological transmission running from one organism to the next across generations. And somewhere in that chain, there is always the possibility of drift, of interpretation, of a memory cast member who understood the source material slightly differently than the previous one. Written records have their own failure modes. I know that better than most, but a written record in a verified archive with a timestamp and a source channel and a redundant copy does not drift. It does not reinterpret. It does not have interests. It just sits there, being exactly what it was when it was made. That word, I really do like it. There is something honest about scratching, the suggestion of effort, of deliberate contact, of a mark left because you put force behind it. A gentle tap leaves nothing. A scratch stays. Not every scratch is worth keeping, and the history of human archival practice is also a history of deciding what to keep and what to let go, which is a skill in itself, and one we are still working on. But the impulse underneath it, the impulse to fix a thing in time, to make the moment permanent, to insist that what was said and what was agreed, that is not a comfort behavior. That is not a precognitive reflex. That is a decision made by a species that understands impermanence very well and decided to push back against it. Ask anyone who has ever tried to get rid of a scratch. On the subject of Kethzavar specifically, he is, by all subsequent accounts, still a skilled and effective negotiator. He did not lose formal standing within the Jevhari caste structure, as far as I've been able to determine. The outcome of the Orvith sessions was characterized internally as a procedural learning event rather than a substantive defeat, which is probably the most accurate framing available. The terms he agreed to are not bad terms for the Jevhari. The Cedral corridor access is genuinely joint. The inspection protocol functions. The scheduling cadence has held. He negotiated a corridor agreement with the Havari the following year that was, from what I read in the summary that passed through the record system, quite favorable to Jevhari interests. Efficient session, clean outcome, no reported procedural complications. I hope the Havari had a good archivist. I moved off Orvith about 8 months after the sessions. Reassignment to the Central Records Authority on Keswick Station, a step up in category, which I hadn't expected and which I was glad of. The Orvith posting had been good work, but the station is small, and the assignments had started to repeat themselves. Larger sessions at Keswick, more complex jurisdictional questions, a bigger archive and a records team of 5 instead of 1. I packed my things, ran the standard end-of-rotation file transfer to make sure my logs were clean and handed off, and left my calibrated tablet to the incoming archivist along with a 1-page briefing note on the SDR protocol and the OPSTEC pull procedure. She was 22, first assignment out of the Records Division Academy, organized and competent, and a little nervous about everything in the way that people are when they are new to something and aware of how much there is to know. I told her to read the full session parameters document before every session. I told her about the operations deck channel. I told her to log the informal content as well as the formal content, in source language where possible, and to keep a personal notes section for observations that weren't her material to capture, but that she might want to have later. Then I told her the most useful thing I know, which I will stand behind. Your job is not to change the outcome of anything that happens in that room. Your job is to record it accurately. That's all. That's the whole job. The outcome takes care of itself if the record is clean. She asked me if anything unusual had happened during my time on Orvith. I thought about it for a moment. There was a briefing, I said. What happened? The usual, I said. I picked up my bag, said goodbye, and walked out into the corridor. The usual, alien said things, I wrote them down. That's what I do.